Have you ever heard that America is a Christian nation? Have you ever heard it like 5 times in one day? Yesterday's one of those kinds of days, right? It's long been popular to declare that America is a Christian nation. And the first person that I could find who articulated this was a Supreme Court justice in 1897. I want to be correct. I'm going to be citing a lot of facts and a lot of history today, so you may see me referencing the notes more than usual. But that justice was David J. Brewer in 1892. Since then, it's been referenced by Dwight D. Eisenhower, not Eisenhower. It's been cited by Woodrow Wilson and a great many other politician and political coalition hoping to mobilize Christians for their agendas. But while many assume this is true, and while it's been stated near unto death, it's not. The US Constitution has no reference to Christianity. It has 3 references to religion. All of them are about hemming in like religious liberty. One is public officials shouldn't have to perform, are prohibited from needing to perform religious tests for public office. Another is the prohibition of establishing a state religion, and the other one is something along those lines. It's not quite separation of church and state, although that is the principle. It's not infringing upon free religious exercise. That's what it is. So you can think of that as like the state shouldn't get in the way of that. We may have that one in RAM because in 2020 we had a lot of folks going throughout the country stating that they shouldn't have to wear masks because of freedom of the assembly for their public religion. And Sean Foyt even came over here and drew out thousands of people for a religious freedom celebration, right? So we have these things. They are part of our Constitution. And then in 1797, we have the Treaty of Tripoli, which states explicitly that we are not founded as a Christian nation. We're not a Christian nation. And yet this lie persists. And it persists because it's useful. It's a useful lie. When it's bantied about, it's often by those who are hoping to project this wondrous, highly Christian and their version of Christianity past. And if we could just reclaim that past, then it'll be glorious. We will be obeying God and we will be living in the good old days. And to the point where we will project this version of Christian history onto America and also onto like the predecessing colonies before the founding of our nation. Let alone that the tensions and the variety of religion in this space was actually quite diverse. We had Muslims in what would become the continental United States before we ever had English practicers of religion, right? We, of course, had indigenous religion practiced here for tens of thousands of years. So I'm going to be referencing Christian nationalism quite a bit because they happen to be the main proponents of this today, the main ones who keep thrusting this out. And I realize I've never defined Christian nationalism, so I want to do that right now. And the quote I have comes from Christianity Today, certainly not a left-leaning rag. Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation. And I want to reference Monty Mader, who Jessica read a quote from earlier. She is a former Christian nationalist and an activist these days, also a recording artist and a teacher and many other things. Christian nationalism is a political ideology that uses Christian symbols, language, and identity to argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, must be governed by Christian principles as interpreted by a specific subset of Christians, and that any deviation from this is an attack on both God and country. The trick is that it wraps political power in the language of the sacred. If you oppose their agenda, it's not just a difference in political opinions, it's direct opposition to God. And that is on purpose. Now, Christian nationalism today has dogmatic adherence by many fundamentalists. I want to say from go that while it has the largest population within what we think of as evangelicalism today, it's not exclusive to that group. It's really anybody who is clinging to a Christian fundamentalist perspective who may have this Christian nationalist perspective. So we have Christian nationalist Catholics and we have Christian nationalist mainline Protestants. But it's greatly put forward and empowered by evangelicals. And that's not just happenstance. That's not a coincidence of history. This happened intentionally. So in the 70s, while desegregation was being initiated throughout our country, there was, of course, a pushback. And one of those areas that there was pushback happened to be in colleges, like Liberty University, the Christian college founded by Jerry Falwell. And he spent years trying to push back on this and mobilize Christians for this cause of getting desegregation to be nipped in the bud. He wanted to roll that back. He didn't want to admit people of color in his schools. The government said, you have to. Here's a big tax fine. He didn't want to pay the big tax fine. Eventually, he paid the big tax fine. Realized he wasn't really gaining traction with this issue. Lucky for him, though, 1974, something happened. Roe versus Wade. And Paul Weyrich, founder of the Heritage Foundation, and him would join forces in 1979 and create the moral majority. Have you ever heard of the moral majority? Okay. And the moral majority, Paul Weyrich and Falwell saw how useful it could be to get folks mobilized around abortion. Now, before this, abortion was seen largely as a Roman Catholic issue. But this alliance is what ends up creating abortion and opposition to it as an identity marker for many evangelicals today. The moral majority was very successful in shifting the culture in that way. And they were very successful in turning out evangelicals and fundamentalist Christians in 1980 for the election of Ronald Reagan. Before this, we had evangelicals and fundamentalists involved in politics, but there was more diversity than we see today. Around the same time, they realized there's other issues that they want to bake into the moral majority. One is opposition to the fledgling gay rights movement, and the other was to oppose feminism. And so these three causes, abortion, feminism, and gay rights, all get coined as traditional family values. This is when we start having that term bandied around as the moral majority's main speaking points. And we still hear it today. Many folks have come to think of traditional family values, as articulated by these gentlemen, as synonymous with being Christian. Around the same time, in 1975, Bill Bright articulates the Seven Mountains Mandate. This one is less common knowledge than the moral majority. I'm wondering if anybody's ever heard this. It's usually just the folks who were raised in a blatantly Christian nationalist setting instead of one that may be flirting with it. So those seven mountains were seen as spheres of influence that Christians ought to be occupying. So the moral majority thought in terms of Christian dominionism. Their version of Christians ought to be occupying the seats of power in this country, and they were thinking largely politically, seats within governments. The Seven Mountains Mandate looks beyond that, and they say, well, that's one sphere of influence that Christians ought to be controlling, but there's six more. Religion, family, arts and entertainment, media, education, and business. Christians, their version of Christians, ought to be controlling these segments within our world as well. This ends up being embraced by Youth with a Mission, YWAM, and Campus Crusade for Christ, and Focus on the Family. The Christian music industry was certainly in existence before then. In fact, if you go and you look up what Christian music, contemporary Christian music was like in the 60s and in the 70s, there was a lot of music put out by the Jesus people. Folks, hippies, who wanted to worship God with their music. And there was a diversity of perspectives within that music. Some of them were very justice-oriented, and others were certainly not. Around this time, we have denominations being formed. And they're embracing this hippie movement, and they're embracing the growth of contemporary Christian music. And the industry shifts, where it no longer is platforming those who may be offensive to the moral majority. And thus we see the sea change because of business, because of demand in the Christian music industry and in other forms of Christian media, where most of the music being put out is headlined by the deeply unoffensive to the Christian nationalists. This is what ended up giving birth to Christian-only entertainment, if any of you ever grew up with that. I did. It was only for a season, luckily. My family destroyed thousands of dollars worth of my dad's favorite music. Because our pastor was like, hey, listen, that's of the devil. And we listened to a song by, I don't know, Jeff Moore in the Distance that said, why should the devil have all the good music? And we're like, that's right. Why should the devil have all the good music? So we destroyed all of these CDs, the Beatles, Queen. I know. It was heartbreaking for my dad, but he was like, well, the pastor said so I got to. So we tried just doing exclusively Christian music and exclusively Christian movies. The music lasted longer than the movies because the movies were really rough. And then eventually we're like, hey, we're being legalistic. That was how my church negotiated that. They're like, we need both. We need Carmen and we need Queen. At the very least, we can criticize Queen. But we should also celebrate good music. This would also give birth to the purity movements. Now, celibacy-only education existed before this. But by embracing the Seven Mountains Mandate, we start hearing the purity movement not only emphasized in youth groups and in churches, but in public schools, too. I went to a little tiny high school outside of McMinnville, Oregon, a town called Sheridan. My senior year, we started off with 72 kids. We ended with 27. Yeah, yeah. Rural poverty is a very real thing and it has very real results for people. And the main form of sex ed that we had was abstinence only purity movement education. So we had a very high teen parenthood rate. And for some reason, this wasn't fixing it. And yet, year after year, this is what was put out. Because of things like this. Christians ought to dominate these 7 mountains, including education. Patriarchy also gains kind of a resurgence for groups that embrace the 7 mountains, and they would say, not only should our churches be led exclusively by men, but all of our families and most of our businesses, and so on and so forth. So it's getting this breath of fresh air and continues to be dominant today because these things haven't gone anywhere. And when Christian nationalism is embraced, like it is increasingly being boldly embraced today, there's a reason you see it correlating with these other points of intersection. Those are all features of it. They're not in opposition to it. Now, I get asked, how can so many Christians support what this administration is doing? I get this asked all the time. It's at least weekly. And much of it is this. That doesn't mean every Christian who voted for Trump is a Christian nationalist, but it reflects the work that Christian nationalists have done. And this vision that is projected is an enticing one for many people. Now, what do they do with the Jesus stuff? I hear it brought up. Well, they misconstrue it, they twist it, or they ignore it. What is heavily leaned on are the stories of origin for the Hebrew people. In Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, especially Joshua, often Judges, the other works of history that are in the Hebrew Bible. And what they do is they say, we are the new Israel. What do we do with genocide? Well, what did the Israelites do when they came into the land of Canaan? Well, God anointed their war efforts, and so they committed a genocide out of obedience to God to purify the land. Sometimes when you hear, God heal our land, this is what's being referenced to. And thus, we're justified in our past history of horrors because the Israelites were justified in their past history of horrors. And so they can certainly utilize these means of reclaiming this country and preaching against that which they view as other and different, because that's what God demanded of Moses and Joshua. Now, if you've been in one of our Wednesday Connect groups, you may have some alarm bells going off. Wait a minute. We have no history, no evidence that such a genocide ever took place. In fact, all of the evidence outside of the pages of the Bible points to the majority of the folks we call Israelites today and Judeans today were an outgrowth of the Canaanite people. They didn't destroy the Canaanites. They were part of the Canaanites and developed a particular identity. Well, why did they make these stories? Because they were oppressed by powerful empires, and when they were able to return back to their lands, they wanted stories that could help unify them, and stories like this were useful for doing so. It was ancient propaganda, and it's being used today, adopted without any kind of critical engagement, as propaganda now as well, along with the propaganda and the lie that we were once originally started as a Christian nation. Two origin stories that are propagandistic and based on lies. Now, I remember going to a worship service at Christ Church, a church that I was a part of for a few years, and they were mourning the state of things. Christ Church was a progressive evangelical church plant. It's no longer around today. It was kicked out of the Evangelical Covenant Church for being open and affirming of LGBTQ plus folks from before the doors were open. I really loved this church, and even when I was doing an internship somewhere else, I thought it was important to go and visit after 2016. And there was a lot of confusion and anger and fear from the folks in my church. One person wore a safety pin. You remember when people were putting safety pins on to say I'm safe? And he said to me, "I'm embarrassed to even call myself a Christian right now." And I get that. I get that. But folks, we have to recognize that just because something has the label Christian on it doesn't make it Christ-like. And we also have to recognize that nobody owns our faith for us. Nobody owns our religion and how we choose to live into it, how we practice it. Just like they don't own how you show up in this country. They don't own how you show up in our nation. For me, I still go back to Christ. It is Christ-likeness I pursue, and not somebody's version of Christianity. And what was Christ like? Well, the Christ-likeness I pursue is radical love and peace-seeking. Peace that is seen in wellness across the board for everyone. And this is what it means to be Christ-like. And this is what I advocate that we keep coming back to. Radical love, radical compassion, radical concern, radical peace, radical inclusion. America's not a Christian nation. It never has been one, and I hope to God it never will be. Because a nation forced to be Christian can never be Christ-like. Christ-likeness requires love, and that love cannot be forced. Christian nationalism cannot truly love its neighbor. It cannot love its enemies. But we can, and we shall. And I know this is some of what keeps us up at night. How do we do that? Well, we continue to be involved in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our county, in our city. We continue to show up. And as we show up, I hope we are motivated not by supremacy, but by love. We want to see all our neighbors have their basic needs met. We want all to have the freedom to love who they love, to have families if they choose or to not, to worship as they are convicted or to not. We want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody, not just for us. Even those who may think of themselves as our enemies. Even those that we worry about coming through that door and sitting right there or standing right there and yelling at us. We want them to know love too. We want them to know peace too. In the end, the only thing that matters is that we love one another and pursue peace. Rita McCarty says, she got that from Jesus. May we all foster such love and peace.